I know things have been hard, but we need to find a way through this together.
The desert has a way of deciding things for you before you even realize you had a choice. That afternoon, the Arizona sun pressed down so hard it felt personal, like it had followed me from my past just to remind me that running never works. I was driving an old pickup through a stretch of highway that barely existed on most maps, headed nowhere important, when I saw her standing alone by the roadside, black dress fluttering in the hot wind, eyes fixed on the ground as if hope itself had learned to look away. I almost didn't stop. People out here learn early not to interfere. Too many stories. Too many regrets. But something about her stillness made the world feel wrong if I kept driving. She wasn't waving her arms or begging for help. She was simply waiting, as if fate had already told her someone would come, or no one would. I pulled over. She didn't smile when she approached the truck. She didn't thank me either. She just looked at me with eyes that had already buried too much and asked quietly, "Are you going toward the reservation?" That question landed heavier than it should have. I nodded. She climbed in, holding a small cloth bundle close to her chest like it was the last piece of her life that hadn't been taken yet. As we drove, the silence between us wasn't awkward, it was sacred. The kind of silence that forms when two broken people recognize each other without needing explanations. She told me her name was Nita. An Apache widow. Her husband had died 3 months earlier in a workplace accident outside the reservation, leaving her with debts she couldn't read and laws she didn't understand. She had been turned away from help offices, ignored by officials, and finally stranded when the bus driver refused her ride for being short on fare. I told her my name was Ethan Cole, a man with no fixed address and a past I didn't like to revisit. I didn't tell her I was running from my own failures, just that I was passing through. Neither of us knew that this ride, given without expectation or reward, would become the point where both our lives stopped running. A kindness that triggered the law. We didn't make it far before the truck overheated, coughing steam like it had finally decided to quit on me. We pulled into a small town near the reservation, one of those places where the courthouse doubles as the post office and everyone knows everyone's grandmother. I told Nita I'd fix the engine and get her the rest of the way by sunset. But life had other paperwork ready. While I worked under the hood, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up slowly. The officer was polite but watchful, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice because he never had to. He asked Nita questions first, about her destination, her family, her legal status. When she explained she was a widow traveling alone, his expression shifted. That's when I learned about the Apache Family Protection Act, an old law rarely enforced but never repealed. A law meant to protect widowed Native women from exploitation during transit between jurisdictions. According to its wording, if a non-tribal man assumed responsibility for transporting a widowed Apache woman across county lines without formal documentation, he became legally accountable for her welfare until she reached stable housing. Accountable didn't mean a fine. It meant temporary guardianship. And because Nita had no registered address, no immediate family, and no housing secured, the law had no expiration date. We stared at the sheriff as if he'd just spoken another language. I tried to explain it was just a ride. She tried to say she never asked for protection. But laws don't care about intentions, only outcomes. By the time the paperwork was done, the sun had started sinking, and something far heavier than night settled between us. "I didn't mean to trap you," Nita whispered. I looked at her then, really looked, and realized something frightening. For the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped. The law required that Nita stay where I stayed. So I rented a small house on the edge of town, 2 rooms, cracked windows, and a porch that faced the desert like it was waiting for answers. We lived like strangers at first, sharing space but not stories. She rose early to pray. I stayed up late to avoid my thoughts. But kindness has a quiet way of softening walls. I noticed how she always left food on my plate even when she ate little herself. She noticed how I fixed things without being asked, the loose door hinge, the flickering light. At night, I sometimes heard her cry softly, and instead of running from it, I stayed awake, guarding the silence. One evening, she finally told me about her husband. How he believed America could be kind if you met it with honesty. How he worked twice as hard to prove they belonged. How his death was ruled unavoidable, even though faulty equipment had been reported weeks earlier. I told her about my past too, how I once walked away from a family who needed me because I was afraid of failing them. How I'd been driving ever since, pretending movement meant progress. Our lives weren't bound by romance or obligation. They were bound by shared survival. And slowly, without ceremony, the house stopped feeling like a legal requirement and started feeling like a shelter. When compassion became a choice. The town didn't approve. People talked. Some with curiosity, others with suspicion. A white man living with an Apache widow under a strange law stirred old prejudices that never really died. Officials came to check compliance. Church ladies offered prayers that felt like warnings. Then came the turning point. A social worker arrived one afternoon with forms that could end the arrangement, if Nita agreed to relocate to a government housing facility hours away. It was legal. Clean. Final. All she had to do was sign. She asked me what I thought. I wanted to say yes. Freedom was right there, printed in black ink. But I saw fear in her eyes, not of me, but of being discarded again. Of becoming another file closed without care. So I did the hardest thing I'd done in years. I told her the truth. That paper ends the law, I said quietly. But it doesn't end loneliness. She didn't sign. Instead, she folded the form carefully and placed it back on the table. In that moment, compassion stopped being something that happened to us and became something we chose. Months passed. Winter came softly. Nita found work teaching traditional crafts at a local school. I found steady work repairing farm equipment. We built routines. Trust. Something like peace. Then the county announced a review. The law that had forced us together would either be dissolved, or permanently binding. If the court decided Nita still lacked independent support, guardianship would become lifelong responsibility unless she married or relocated. Everyone assumed she would leave. On the day of the hearing, Nita stood before the judge with calm strength. She spoke about dignity. About how protection without respect is just another cage. About how one act of kindness had given her space to heal. Then she looked at me. And this man, she said, voice steady, never treated me like a burden or a duty. He treated me like a human being. The judge paused. Then asked me one question. If the law were removed today, he said, would you still choose to stay? I didn't hesitate. Yes. Not because the law demanded it, but because compassion had already rewritten my life. Forever, redefined. The ruling was unexpected. The court dissolved the forced guardianship, but offered us a choice. Legal partnership, equal and voluntary, recognized by both state and tribal law. Not marriage. Not obligation. Just chosen family. We signed. Years later, people still ask how it started. I tell them it began with a ride. With stopping when it would have been easier not to. With learning that sometimes the law forces your feet to stop, but your heart decides where you stay. Nita now runs a cultural center. I help where I can. The house still faces the desert, but it no longer feels empty. Because the greatest truth I learned is this. Kindness given freely can bind lives more powerfully than any law, and when compassion becomes a choice, forever becomes a gift.